Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Rudolph Araujo, and I lead the strategy and marketing teams here at Awake Security, which is now a division of Arista Networks. I wanted to welcome and thank you all for joining us today. I mean, there's no shortage of webinars in this day and age, so we appreciate your attendance. And hopefully we can make this worth your time. We have a pretty illustrious panel that I'll talk about in a second. Today's topic is, CISO Perspectives. Is your security program equipped to defend threats like SolarWinds? The reality of it is even the most hardened of security professionals were surprised by the events in December. First, when FireEye announced that it had been hacked, and then just about a week later, when we found out that it was the SolarWinds campaign that was the cause of the FireEye breach in the first place. And we now know that attack affected a number of pretty significant organizations that we'd all like to believe have fairly mature security programs. These supply chain attacks are really not new, right? Perhaps what has made them big news was really the scale and maybe the profile of these victims. And it raises really two questions. If you're a technology vendor like SolarWinds, how do you make sure you don't become the next conduit, if you will? And then secondly, as an organization with myriads of software applications installed in your environment, is it really possible to keep an attack like this out, right? How do you kind of trust the trust, if you will? So to discuss and debate these topics, as I mentioned, we're joined today by three great security leaders. I'll start at the top left here. George Finney is the CISO at Southern Methodist University, and as a CISO at a large university, George deals with a complex set of supply chain and indeed an environment as a whole. We've got Malcolm Harkins, former CISO at Intel, Silence, and member of Awake and Arista CISO Advisory Board. Throughout his career, Malcolm has seen firsthand, a number of these kinds of more complex attacks. And last but not least, we have Jason Beavis, VP of Awake Labs, who leads a team that has responded to some of the world's most consequential breaches over the years. From places like Mandiant, places like the government and Department of Defense and so on. He's actually had some involvement in investigating potential SolarWinds compromises as well. So we'll look to get that perspective too as we dive into this. I do want to encourage you as we get through this discussion. Keep the interactivity. Drop the questions in the Q&A or in the chat feature in Zoom. We'd like to keep this interactive. And hey, maybe our illustrious panel will learn a thing or two from the audience as well today. So with that, Malcolm, George, and Jason, welcome and thank you for joining us. I want to go back to something I said in the intro. Right, this is not really a new attack. Right, I mean, we've seen these kinds of attacks in the past. Maybe if I ask each of you, what surprised you the most and perhaps the least about the events in December? George, maybe I'll start with you.
So yeah, again, just thank you for having me be a part of the panel. I'm taking SolarWinds personally. I actually started out my career as a network engineer, and I've used SolarWinds and I've used the Orion product. And so totally, it's not a new phenomenon. But I think this is probably one of the first incidents that I can recall that really kind of something that's so near and dear to a security engineer's heart was used to get malware in. Right. I think we're in a way maybe we think that we're above being hacked because as a security industry we take things so seriously, and I think that's why people were so kind of concerned that FireEye out of all of us was breached, and then to find out that that SolarWinds, which is in a lot of high-profile clients' environments, was used as kind of a Trojan to get in. Gosh, it's such a big concern. And I think we'll dig into the details on how you could have stopped it later, but yeah, I think whether it's Adobe or Microsoft, right? We don't trust our software. We're always doing checks on it. But in a way, it's kind of like the cobbler's kids have no shoes. Maybe it just kind of fell under the radar, or we kind of forgot about it because we were worrying about so many other things. And I think it's one of those things where you have to be vigilant all the time and treat everything kind of with suspicion. And I think we're all kind of reflecting about hey, what else is there that maybe could have been used to get into our environments, and maybe take a hard look at some of those other things.
Yeah, Jason, anything surprise you, or maybe not surprise you?
Yeah, I mean, I think what surprised me really the most was the longevity of it being in place, and the fact that none of the military, none of the major corporations had detected it. And we all know, FireEye's got some of the best threat hunters in the world, and it's just kind of shocking that it took so long for someone to pick up the threat. I think on the least surprising, and it's kind of to George's point, maybe a little bit personally, is we started tracking like our third parties at extensive layers, and SolarWinds was on that list. And immediately when this thing came out, I went to look at our data on SolarWinds, and like every other team that's overwhelmed in that, there was a significant amount of data not there on its third-party connections that we had tracked on other entities. And it just goes to show, even some of the teams that are in this every day, we still run into the churn of there's just so much data and what to focus on, to George's point, that I would love to have mapped out every one of my third parties completely. And it's no surprise I didn't quite have all of SolarWinds IPs, namespace, all that mapped out, and their traffic flows and things like that we try to do it away. So again, goes down to the challenge of every operational team.
Yeah, and Malcolm, if I can switch to you, right? I mean, as this investigation has actually gotten deeper, it looks like it might be SolarWinds itself was a victim of a supply chain compromise, right? So where does this kind of trail lead, right? And something that you brought up as we were talking about this is where's the accountability, right? How do you kind of come to some kind of closure here?
Yeah, and it's hard, right? Because there's this daisy chaining, right, of the supply chain, so to speak. But let me also make a comment to one of your first things about the technology providers, and this being a wake-up call for those that provide technology solutions. I think everybody's a technology provider. NASDAQ, people think, is a stock exchange. They sell technology into companies to manage products and services. McKesson in the healthcare area provides services and technology under some context. Heck, even Walmart and Sam's probably provide some level of supply chain software, or the Sam's app on my phone is updating stuff. So you have to think outside of the box of the traditional tech sector, number one. And so that means we all need to be looking at the technology we're providing, our channel, our customers, and that type of stuff, and how we could be part of the supply chain compromise. But to your point on the daisy chaining and the accountability, again, it really comes down to, and I don't know, right? We'll see this over time. But if you presume that SolarWinds had a reasonably mature information security program and product security program, then the question becomes, how could this have occurred? Well, it could have occurred because their InfoSec team didn't coordinate with their product security team, because a lot of people see those as separate things, in which case you'd have a gap in understanding of your risk and controls, because you wouldn't think of an information security event creating a product security event. I always did, because I owned both at Intel. I owned and oversaw both at Cylance. So I think of those things as inextricably linked. And even to the points on FireEye, again, they have a mature program, but we all know you can't eliminate risk. And again, this maliciousness nested in a trusted system means that the trust has become the attack surface, in which case you're not going to instrument to look at something at that level that you trust, which again is a false way to look at things. You could argue that the thing that you trust the most should be the thing you inspect the most, because if I was the attacker, that's what I would go after, with the assumption that if you trust it enough, you're going to be a little bit less diligent in how you're reviewing it.
Yeah, no, I think you make a good point, and we actually have a question that I think aligns maybe with this. And I'll open it up to any of you, since I think it's equally applicable. Can the SOC be blamed for the SolarWinds hack? Right? Who do we blame within the organization?
I think that's a hard question. I think the SOC can only respond to things that that they have visibility to, and if they didn't have visibility, if they weren't instrumented to be able to detect it, it's a hard thing to detect. It's a hard thing to know. Like Jason was saying, how all of your apps are supposed to work, and so do you have the ability to find anomalies in that kind of traffic pattern? I think it's incredibly hard, and I also worry a little bit, frankly, about automation. The news that kind of broke my heart last week was that Palo Alto had detected it, both in October as well as in November, and they kind of just dismissed it. Presumably they stopped it from doing anything within Palo, but the bigger picture there is if Palo, maybe it was an automated thing, maybe the SOC saw it and shut it down, but Palo had an opportunity to do what FireEye did for the rest of the cybersecurity community and get that word out there and shorten this lifespan by another couple of months, and they didn't. So is that the SOC? Maybe they did their job to shut it down, but again, there's that more global approach that, hey, maybe we can do more. Let's take a look at our customers. Let's refer this over, like Malcolm said, to Unit 42 and have them, look across the customer base and see who else might be impacted. I think those kinds of things we're clearly missing. And, I think there's enough blame to go around. I also think that we probably shouldn't, assign blame, and maybe we can get better by working together more as a community. I think pointing blame, splits us apart.
Yeah, and to your point, George, the accountability question isn't really to assign blame in the liability sense if we do it properly. It's to understand where we made a mistake so that we can learn from it. Because if we approach it that way, it's kind of like the National Transportation Safety Board when a large scale airline or railroad or something like that happens, and you go methodically look through and go, where could we have done better, right? And even your point on Palo Alto, not to rationalize it, but the SolarWinds capability operationally in large enterprise is pretty noisy, right? And within that noise, then you go, yeah, they might have discounted it, but if it's so noisy for certain things, for the management and overhead and stuff like that, that little signal is going to get lost in the noise again, right? And you go, well, it's a trusted thing, it's noisy, and I'm not, and then you go look at it and say, well, is that noise and issues CIO failure? Is it the head of IT operations failure? Or heck, I know some CISOs that didn't even know how far SolarWinds was deployed in their environment. That gets back to an IT asset management issue where people didn't know physically or logically where they had it in their environment. So, that's you could argue, a day one issue for a CIO not doing their job if they don't know what's installed in their environment.
Yeah, and I think you brought up the idea of the daisy chain, right? I mean, we're even hearing of victims now that didn't have SolarWinds in their environment at all, right? And so it's become this, kind of morass, I suppose, maybe the best way to describe it. Jason, kind of you touched on this a little bit earlier, right? I mean, one of the things I was intrigued by was just listening to Kevin Mandia at an event talk about how his team and how the internal team at FireEye detected it. I guess how should our audience think about detection strategies for something like this, right? I mean, obviously, not everyone's equipped with the same level of expertise as FireEye. What can the rest of the mere mortals, if you will, do?
Yeah, no, I mean, detection it's a hard business, and I don't want to underplay one of the things that came into kind of the chat about doing a root cause analysis. I mean, that goes to the point of getting better at detection on a regular basis, but I think, there's a combination of humans and technology you need. And FireEye has the best of breed of some of the both over there at some level, and that's why they're able to pick something up. And I think where we get to is we have organizations sometimes that put in too much technology. They don't have the skills to run it. And what happens is you've got alerts that get overlooked and things like that. We've seen that time and time again with attacks where we've got the tech, it picks it up. We didn't understand it. We didn't know what to do. And then there's organizations that, they can't afford the skill set. And then they're dependent on third-party service providers to to do that skill set, and the question goes, how well do you manage that third-party security provider, their service, and what they're doing also? So, I think the real key that you got to look at as, a company is you got to have a balance of that technology, your AI strategy, and human expertise, whether it's inside or outside, to make sure you're providing a comprehensive approach. And you got to leverage your peers. For those of you who don't know, like Malcolm and I, we talk every now and then just to understand what's going on in the community, what's happening at other companies, and you share that knowledge, that intel, and you try to feed it back into your teams. And that helps you realize some of the threats, some of the things you're missing out there that you just don't think about when you're kind of in the weeds in your own organization daily.
Thanks, Jason. Hey, Malcolm, I want to go back because there's a comment here that I think we'd like to go back to something that you said, Malcolm, earlier, which is, look, everyone's a technology vendor, right? And you touched on kind of product security versus information security. What are some best practices if, as a technology provider, again, everyone is one, to maybe avoid some of these? Have you put some thought into that?
Yeah, well, again, for me, I'm one of those big things: structure drives behavior, and you get what you measure. So if your information security program and for lack of a better word, your product security program, so the technology you're providing to others, are managed separately, you're going to miss things. And it doesn't mean they have to report to the same individual, but you need to have a structure understanding the interdependencies of those risks. And if you're providing technology updates or anything out to people, you need to think about, in essence, that supply chain of the software distribution or update process as an attack vector. And then how can that be compromised? I see this, obviously I work for a web application security defense company today. You think of all the third-party code that's in a website that is linked from something else that gets changed. There's very few people are even doing that type of integrity checking on that third-party embedded code because there's updates happening on it. The marketing team doesn't know because they just got a widget from somebody, stuck it there. The e-commerce team grabbed something from somebody, and it's all on their website. And they're like, well, I'm just selling stuff. Yet they're basically providing a pathway for a water hole attack where if any of those updates can be compromised and then push, you can get an in-session hijacking, you could get a malicious code download, you pop the system, and then all of a sudden, even if I'm a school district and I have a website for parents and students to log in, I might be the pathogen to compromising, the students or the parents. Right. And we have to think that way. And if we think that way, then we can start dialing in where the critical risk issues are and then how to go about managing and mitigating it.
Yeah, George, if I go to you with, as a segue to that, right, is this just becoming an intractable problem, right? I mean, like as a CISO, how big is your attack surface, right? I mean, and how do you think about it?
So, here at a kind of medium-sized university, we've got, I think over 300 apps that we provide for the campus, and those rely on other services. We've got multiple Class B networks. We've got, tens of thousands of endpoints that are on the campus at any given time, even, during the pandemic, right? But I don't necessarily agree that I think the problem's intractable. And I hate to jump to zero trust right away. But when you look technically at what this attack did, the first thing that the malicious DLL file would do is it called out to some command and control domains, right? And when I think about SolarWinds as a product, what it did is it really helps you manage your routers, your switches, your firewalls. Maybe you've got an out-of-band management network that you communicate SNMP with. But the first thing in my mind is, why would you have ever had SolarWinds deployed to have direct outbound internet access, unfettered outbound internet access, right? From a zero trust perspective, that should have never been the case. Unfortunately, it sounds like it was deployed that way. I understand, that it's a challenge to manage and to to know, the ins and outs of every port on every IP address that every application in your environment needs to talk to. The zero trust, you have challenges with scalability, doing microsegmentation. Some of the products we've seen out there have trouble, just documenting what ports they even run on, whether they're UDP or TCP. And I think that's something that's pervasive as an industry, and I think we need to get better at that. I think having better insights to that would allow us to be more restrictive in our firewall rules. And that's not a next gen firewall thing. That's not next gen antivirus. That's really just basic architecture.
Yeah, this is me checking off, by the way, that at webinar finishing school, they teach you that if you say zero trust, your webinar is a success.
Yeah, fill out that spot on your if you got 5 in a row.
Jokes aside, though, right? I mean, I think one of the things that this certainly brings out, and I think what you were getting at, George, is thinking about your threat model, right? And I guess Malcolm or Jason, either of you, both of you kind of touched on this earlier. Jason, when you were talking about just understanding what are your third-party stuff and who they're talking to, what should they be talking to, etc. I mean, is it? I think George said, it's not next gen this, next gen that. It's just basic blocking and tackling. I mean, is it really that simple?
I'll jump in, Malcolm. I mean, I think one of the things we always get back to sort of fundamentals a lot in security, and we find that they're not followed on a lot of organizations. And I mean, part of this just goes to maintaining hygiene in your org and, understanding, are you holding good hygiene across the board? I can't tell you, when we go in on incident responses, we drop in, and everyone who's hit by ransomware, it comes down to the same things George is talking about. Like, why are all your servers allowed to talk out on ports and protocols that they should have never been allowed to talk out on? So it does come to grasping some of that. I think the other piece is really trying to understand what's good and bad traffic too, though, from some of these, and that becomes a more complex problem. So even though you can get the hygiene down, you're going to come to a point where there's still things that are difficult with the supply chain attack. And to Malcolm's point, if you're sort of chasing down the supply chain, I mean, take for example the cloud. Okay, we haven't really seen a huge attack there. If you're going to look at a huge attack in the cloud, how would you go about the supply chain of that? And these are things we're trying to think of ahead of and get ahead of the market. And what I know is every one of them pulls a bunch of mirrors and repos constantly. Okay, so all it takes is someone to be able to intercept that supply chain and affect the cloud environment. But do I know enough of good and bad about all these mirrors, all these repos, all these repositories, all the RPM files? I don't right now, okay? But that's the type of real challenge that is complex to get ahead of, okay? And that we need to be mapping out.
Malcolm, anything else you'd add?
Yeah, I think Jason hit it spot on. And the other thing, again, I had a peer dialogue on this. Several of us got together over some virtual wine a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about SolarWinds. And again, it got back down to this third-party stuff and the asset management stuff. And asset management isn't sexy, right? Nobody wants to do it. And as I was talking to folks, and it's like, who owned IT asset management at Intel for a long time? Me. Why? Because I knew it was the beginning of everything I needed to manage from a control perspective. So guess who ended up owning end of life of certain operating systems? Me, because IT would get 85% of the way done and then spike the ball in the end zone, leave the remaining 10 or 15% as a mess because they had to move to the next thing, right? And so as much as the security teams hate it, we are the cleanup crew and we got to own it. Because if we don't, we're stuck with the issue at the end of the day anyway. So just go, take the job that nobody wants to do it and do it well because your job will be easier. George is laughing because he's probably had similar experiences.
Yeah, I mean, it's just funny. I started out my career working at Toys R Us, and the dirty job every night to close out the store was to clean up the Barbie aisle. Nobody wanted to go do it because the collectors would go in and they'd rifle all the way through the the masses of pink boxes, and they'd just be trashed. And yeah, I mean that you have to have that kind of mindset. And I was the guy to go in every night and clean up the Barbie aisle and make it perfect and straight, so that the next day, some little girl can find her pretty Barbie. But yeah, if you don't have that mindset and security, I think that's exactly right. You can't. You can't just finish everything out when you're in IT, because you've got other priorities. And security, we have to own it, and we're empowered to own it. We can put pressure on the right places, and we can make things happen. But at the end of the day, we're going to either own the risk, or we're going to own cleaning it up. So I prefer to get it right before there's a problem.
Yep, me too.
This kind of discussion around the threat model, and how to think about the threat and how to think about the assets, etc. There's a comment here that I think is relevant, right? I mean, are we over rotated on kind of malware? Looking for malware, looking for things that are, kind of have this signature of badness around it, when maybe the attackers have evolved, or maybe we've gotten so good at detecting malware that the attackers have been forced to evolve. I mean, what are your thoughts around that?
For me, it's, we do this pendulum swing, right? We over rotate in one direction, and then we ignore something. We over rotate in the next direction and do something. I go, you can't stop, looking and trying to identify malicious code and mitigate it. At the same time, to your point, if that's all you're doing, then you're going to have a blind spot on looking for the other tactics and ways in which north, south, east, west movement's going to occur, right? And you're going to be blind to one thing because you're only looking for an executable, right? So I think you have to appropriately do both, and then have the ability to dial one up and dial the other one down depending upon the context of the situation.
Yeah,
George?
I mean, I think that's totally right. I mean, looking at some of the next gen AV products that are out there, I mean, this was signed code by the vendor, right? So, sure, you can have your mathematical models that can kind of predict stuff, but I mean, this was signed code, and a lot of vendors missed it because of that. So if you're not hunting down your blind spots, maybe you've got something on the network to give you visibility into what that was doing. Maybe you've got other avenues to kind of do threat hunting and find where we're going out to DGAs, for example, which SolarWinds was doing. I think you've got to be hunting down all of your blind spots to make sure you're not missing something.
So, I guess, George, on that note, what role in your mind does technology have to play with this, right? I mean, what has your experience been?
I mean, my philosophy is, kind of based on Socrates, right? You've got to know thyself. And you can't outsource your security to an MSSP and just expect them to own it. At the end of the day, you still have that. And I think, our experience has been, we've got a SOC, we've got an MSSP, we've got a threat hunting service. And, it's still, well, we're weird, we're a university, we've got unusual things that our faculty members or students do. And all of those other vendors rely on us knowing how it is that SMU operates, and what networks are, where are certain things allowed on and not. All of those playbooks, run books, you've got to own that. I think especially as you change vendors over time, again, you don't want to lose that knowledge, from one vendor to the next. You've got to have a way of maintaining that and growing that over time. I think that to me boils down to people and having the habit of constantly kind of being on the lookout for blind spots. And some of that's through diversity of technology. Some of that's through diversity of human beings with different perspectives.
Jason, anything you'd add?
I think George did a pretty good job. I mean, anytime you're single threaded, you're looking at even malware detection, or you're you're looking at one component that you think is going to solve it. I think that's a mistake. I think technology plays a big role. I think humans play a big role. I think your practices play a big role, and I think that's what George was saying. And it's very clearly you need a combination of things, and you need a combination of items that can help change behavior in your staff to look for these items, which is what George was also hinting at. And one of the bigger challenges I usually have when you're using even all of those is how do we get the behavior and the practices of individuals to constantly do that? I mean, the Barbie example was great. George would come in and clean up after every time. I think we're always cleaning up after is the problem right now. And how do you get your own staff across the board to just try to maintain better security with the technology, with the processes in place? And that's where I think we as a community really still have a big challenge that we don't have tools or capabilities to force behavior change better.
Yeah, you brought up something interesting, Jason. I was talking to one of our customers, a CISO at a pharmaceutical company, and one of the things he said is like, hey, every time one of these attacks breaks out, every security vendor puts out a blog post or a video saying, hey, this is how to detect this threat, right? And he said, as a practitioner, as an end user, I can't help look at that and think, are we just doomed to detect these attacks after they become the headlines? How do we get ahead of the next attack, right? And I guess Malcolm is someone that's worked on kind of both sides of the fence, right? Being at a consumer and a security provider. How should both the security industry think about this, but how should kind of the customer think about this as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, the reality is you can't eliminate risk, right? We can't eliminate it physically, we can't eliminate it logically. And so you can't, like when I went to Silence, right, a prevention company, they were highly negative on detection and response. Why? Because they had a prevention bias. Well, I have a prevention bias too, but I recognize I always need to detect and respond. Why? Because I can't eliminate risk. And so then the question becomes, with those three, macro control types, how do you apply prevention, detection, and response in your security development lifecycle? How do you do it in your endpoints? How do you do it in your network? How do you do it in your applications? How do you do it in your identity access control? And so you've got to look at the control mix and what they're good for, and then the implications on things, and I've done some, my webinars and stuff with you when I've walked through my 9 box of controls, right, that everybody knows before, and I go, take that concept of the control types, automated, semi-automated, manual, and the friction, and then you have to look systematically, area by area by area, and then constantly do a level of weeding and feeding and saying, how do I constantly push towards automation to lower cost? How do I constantly push to prevention to reduce the potential harm? And then how do I remove the friction? And in some cases, prevention is the worst control. Why? Because it's going to screw up the user experience. It's going to, frustrate your business velocity, in which case, go instrument the right detection and response capabilities to minimize damage, and don't worry about the prevention. So, and it sounds odd to do that, but that's what I think our job is to really understand it and then appropriately apply the controls and then make sure that they're implemented to get the outcome that you anticipate. And if they're not, stop doing the control.
Yeah, we have a comment here that someone said, hey, culture is a big part of this as well, right? And security mindset. I think Jason, you touched on this. Just that, the Barbie doll analogy, right? I mean, how much is that going to be part of the detection strategy, if you will, for again, today it's SolarWinds, it's the supply chain threat. The attackers are not stopping. How important is culture? I guess, George, maybe you've got an interesting problem, right? Because you've got employees, you've got faculty, you've got students. How do you think about culture of security?
So Malcolm has his 9 box. I've got my 9 cybersecurity habits. Culture is one of the main habits, and I think it's such a hard thing to do, because as a security officer, you're not necessarily empowered to change the culture of the organization. You're not the chief culture officer. And certainly, a lot of that's, that's about the industry, right? In higher education, we're all about academic freedom. A lot of the culture comes from the top down. I think the way that we can influence that is through one of the other habits is mirroring. And I think holding a mirror up to the organization, or having outside, groups like your pen testing team or like your threat hunting service coming in asking questions about the way that you're doing things is really helpful to see yourself in a new light. So when we get a message from our threat hunting group that said, hey, you got this IP address coming in from China doing this weird stuff. Well, I mean, it's okay if it's a Chinese faculty member. I mean, he's a part of our organization. He's doing, legitimate things. But it helps us ask questions about, well, okay, this is legit, but do we have the right visibility in place? Should this be one of the things that we do? And I think just keeping that in a more of a real-time conversation so that we can provide questions or visibility back into the organization that they don't have to think about those things. I think that allows the organization to play a role in helping change the culture of the organization from the inside out rather than from the outside in.
Jason, you look like you've got something to say.
No, I mean, it's true. We one of the things we really try to focus on when we manage our clients is trying to look at the things that do like reinforce the behavior of the org. So, if you look at kind of like how attackers come in these days, they get in, they pillage, they look for passwords and stuff like that. So one of the things we're really good at is finding, different sets of data like passwords in the organization. And in one of my clients, I asked him, I said, so why haven't we fixed this problem yet? And his answer was, I can't get funding for something like OnePass. And I said, well, how can we help you? And it turned out like his users kind of get it, but a good portion of them, some of them don't. And then he had an executive education thing. So to George's point, we actually helped him with some presentations on, how the stuff is leveraged in ransomware and different attacks, things like that, and help kind of communicate to his board how this can actually reduce your risk significantly because you're essentially leaving credentials all over the organization. So I think George's point is spot on with, bringing in people to help kind of look at it maybe differently than you might in your own org.
Hey, one other thing to add on culture, and again, I know George probably thinks the same way. Culture is the strongest form of control. Why? Because it's innate in how people behave, right? And we've got one way to measure and see if you've got a security culture is not, is the security team visible? Do they get called before the board? But, when there's a security review, is the business unit general manager responsible for intellectual property in the data protection discussion with you with their neck on the line saying, I'm doing my best in my division with the security team to manage our intellectual property, or they know where to be found, right? There's different ways in which you can instantiate accountability, ownership, tone from the top. Just like, take a different example. If a company has harassment and hostility issues, do you just go blame the head of HR, or is it a cultural thing all the way through, right? So we have to start thinking about it that way, and the executives and the boards of the companies need to start looking at it with that lens to create the right, again, tone from the top, mutual accountability, and a pervasive culture. And until they do that, we're going to have this, the security team's going to be the only cultural, leg of the stool, in which case 2 of them are not going to be there and we're still going to be wobbly.
Well, and I'll just add to that, in the book, I talk about how, I looked at companies that were breached, and companies with bad cultures as measured on Glassdoor were 3 times more likely to have been the victims of a data breach. So, there's so many reasons. Companies with great cultures also are more profitable, but they're also more secure. To take the negative example, right? If you have an organization, you set the tone at the top, where they're always asking for exceptions, or they yell when things don't get done. Well, when your CFO gets that BEC email saying pay this invoice for $10 million, I'm on a flight to China, don't call me back, and they pay it. Well, of course, you set the tone from the top. That's culture. That's why these things are happening, and I think that matters so much. I mean, it's a challenge, especially today, where CEOs are getting fired for not getting security right, but we're not doing security education or conversations around culture in business schools, right? So you look at the top 20 MBA programs in the country, there are 0 cybersecurity classes that they can take. So if CEOs are getting fired today, that means the next generation of CEOs that are getting their MBAs now, and 10, 15, 20 years from now, it's going to be the same problem unless we start to make a change today.
Yeah, so I want to pivot into kind of the incident response side of this as well. But before we do that, one kind of comment that I'd love to get each of you to weigh in on. Clearly supply chain attacks are all the news right now, right? But again, the attackers are not stopping, right? If they know that you're focusing on that, they're going to move on. So, what keeps each of you up at night, maybe, thinking about what that next attack might look like?
For me, probably just because I'm anchored in my few decades at Intel, I worry about some stuff below the operating system a lot. I always have, because I think most people are still struggling with above the operating system issues, and we haven't seen anything substantial in that space. But again, bricking a system at a firmware level, good luck recovering it.
And that in itself could be a supply chain threat too, right? Because of how fragmented the supply chains are for systems today. George, anything that's on top of your radar?
I would say identity. I mean, that was one of the outcomes of SolarWinds, was the admin level accounts were compromised that for users that were on that server. And it's for companies that are digging out from being impacted by SolarWinds. Oh my gosh, if your domain admin creds were compromised as a result of that, and your Active Directory or your other identity providers, downstream were also compromised, there's no way that you can, I mean, even if you're starting from scratch, you're still going to have a lot of suspicion around, whether you can trust your identities or not. That's a huge problem, and oh my gosh, I mean that definitely keeps me awake at night, no pun intended.
Jason?
Yeah, I mean, I like what Bolton said, because when I look at this, I want to use a broad term before I go into like an area. I think you're looking at something that has a very broad landscape and can have a significant impact, and identity goes across the board. You're looking at what Malcolm said, hitting a chip, hits every operating system. I remember when I was at Intel and McAfee, I used to think, wow, these guys own 70% of the internet now with the AV, the devices, with the chips on it. They could shut down anybody in the world. And if somebody malicious got in and essentially did something to an org like that, who has such a footprint across the world. And I look at now, and this is why I focus a lot on cloud. I look at the 3 major cloud providers essentially, and I say their impact is just phenomenal if you're able to get into one of them and into their systems and what they're doing, and figure out how to do some similar type of attack. And I know it's also pretty complicated. We don't see, and maybe they're there, and maybe we're just not seeing that many attacks, but we see as misconfigurations. That's what kind of keeps me up at night. Why are we not seeing? I usually go to where the quiet is and start to dig, because that means nobody's looking enough.
Yeah, no, that's actually a good point. I mean, I think in December there was an outage with GCP, and something like Slack, a whole bunch of systems just went offline, right? So yeah, I do think that's actually something worth looking at. It's almost like the the evolution of what Malcolm was talking about earlier as well. It's not just hardware now, but it's hardware as a service, right? That's being delivered to you. So we've got a few minutes left. So let's actually pivot into incident response. And Kevin Mandia used to always say, you don't get judged on whether you got breached or not. You get judged based on how you respond to the breach. And to their credit, FireEye and Kevin personally got a lot of kudos on how they reacted to both their own breach, but then a week later disclosing the SolarWinds breach, right? Well, what are some lessons to be learned? Maybe Jason, I'll start with you since you kind of live this life every day.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting because we've had a couple of SolarWinds cases where we got called in by the customer to do response in their environment, and every one of them was what we call attorney-client privilege (ACP), and strictly controlled. Even their own IT staff, they didn't let see some of the stuff. And the reason being is it was so driven by auditors to control the response out to the customer community. And I get why they're doing that and everything. But it goes to George's point earlier about if you have data and you find you're compromised at some level, and yet you don't communicate it to a larger community like Palo Alto did, you're kind of hurting the community. And I think Kevin and the team over there, they did a phenomenal job. You had a couple people naysaying at the beginning, FireEye got hacked. And then at the end, they came out as heroes of how they responded. They enabled the community with their ISCs. They came out and explained exactly how to do, certain mitigations around it. They documented everything they had technically. And I think as IR firms, you have a responsibility of that. We've got a couple of things now where we're tracking 2 different items, as similar we did on Chrome earlier, that, if you don't get that data out to the community and provide a thorough technical response and recommendations on what you should do and get it out in a timely manner, you're really doing a disservice to everyone in the community.
Malcolm, George?
Yeah, for me, again, nothing to hopefully sound too negative to any lawyers that are listening. But if lawyers are managing what you communicate and how you communicate, and I get why the need for that from a liability protection, all you're doing is protecting yourself, and you're not protecting those that your stakeholders or your customers. And so they need to have a voice in it and need to help figure out how to communicate certain things. But they should not be in charge of when or what is communicated, just how, and with some messaging. Because if you do that, then you're demonstrating, as Jason mentioned, the right social responsibility, that we all have in the world, because we're all connected. And that doesn't, it doesn't mean whether it be SolarWinds, FireEye, heck, if widget.company was breached, they should take the same thing and talk about what happened and how it occurred and what they've done as soon as it's appropriate to do it. I think Cloudflare, if you look back a couple of years ago or a year or so ago, they had some issues, and I think they did a very good job of being very quick to explain what happened, how they did it, what steps they were taking. And so I think we got to hold people up who do that as role models, because they're really stepping up to that responsibility versus just being insular from a worry about liability perspective.
I wholeheartly agree with that. Looking at like the Zoom 0 days that came out, this time last year, we're on Zoom now, right? We, and I think they owned it, right? And they responded very rapidly. Full disclosure, I am an attorney. So, don't hold that against me. But when I look at what SolarWinds itself is going through, I get why they want to be very cautious. They're now facing insider trading allegations, shareholder lawsuits, because the executives perhaps coincidentally sold tens of millions of dollars of stock before the news became public. But there are going to be a lot of questions that are going to be very hard. And to me, when I think about IR, the one thing we haven't mentioned is you got to practice that. You've got to have tabletop exercises. You've got to be doing them regularly. This I think supply chain attack has to be in your tabletop exercise playbook moving forward. You've got to know how you're going to respond, and how your legal team will interact or not, how your PR team will interact with you, so that you can have an impact on your community. And I think, we say a rising tide raises all ships. The cyber criminals out there are sharing that information, and they know how to exploit us, right? They've shown that. So if we're not sharing information amongst ourselves, we're only setting ourselves up to be victims next time.
Let me jump in.
Sure.
I got two things just to add on to what George and Malcolm. I think one of the key things as a lawyer, so a lot of people here might be CISOs on, you as a CISO can help direct your legal response in many ways. So just make sure, when your insurance or your lawyers are guiding you down a route, make sure you're speaking up and kind of communicating, enabling the field in the right language and help them craft that. I think that's so important to do. And then one point George mentioned on the tabletops, we do a lot of tabletops. I think they might be scripted sometimes. And to George's point, use SolarWinds example. Use the most detailed examples you can get, because what I find is a lot of people just do textbook tabletops, and you really kind of got to get into a little bit deeper of the reality of it and make sure your team knows how to respond to the real event.
Yeah, and I think this touches on, maybe the last topic we'll have time for, right, Jason? So you talked about tabletops, George, you brought that up as well. What are some other IR playbook kind of best practices, not just for, this particular breach, right? Because again, unfortunately, this is probably not going to be the last breach. What are some things that have worked for each of you in the past that maybe our audience should think about if they're not doing it already? Malcolm, maybe I'll start with you.
So for me, again, similarly, I always tried to drill in the extreme to be prepared for the ordinary. And in even event when I was back at Intel, again, you'll find this funny. We actually did a 36-hour follow the sun corporate incident, drill, and it was solar flares literally in the sun being so extreme that as the sun went up around the world, it was disrupting power, communications, air flights. We had some sites call in and fake riots. Our computing was shutting down. We exercised every business unit. We exercised every site. And I didn't know the drill. I was running corporate emergency management as well as the CISOs. So it was also a drill for the corporate emergency operations center. And it was so extreme and so out of the ordinary. But guess what? We learned a few things out of it that then we played with a few things on our travel and a couple other things. And it was like 6 months later that Iceland volcano erupted, and ash went over, and then it disrupted different things. And guess what? Because we had already dreamed, done a tabletop in such an extreme way, we tuned up a few things, and so it's basically a non-event. So and as Jason said, get detailed, but also I'd swing it so far to the extreme that it's so over the top that you wrestle through the oh crap moment, right? Like you could take a malware incident and say, I had an executive with inappropriate data on their laptop that got leaked, a video of something. I mean, you just twist it in so far that you've got not only an incident, a leak, now a personnel issue with an executive who might need to be let go or might be charged with a felony. I mean, just take it to the extreme and then figure out how you're going to, because if you can scenario play your way through that, some of this stuff is going to be pretty mundane to walk through.
So I love that, and I'll just add, again, in terms of testing, I love kind of the idea of a live fire, pen test to test your capabilities of your SOC, right? So maybe you let them know that you're doing a test, maybe you don't, but I think that's one of the ways that you can drill for, okay, well, now we're in the midst of it, and what do we do? And they created a ticket. That's great. They saw it. Well, how are you going to engage them to do IR, and are they going to do the right things and follow your playbook or not? And do they deviate, and why? Same with if you have a threat hunting service, and I know Awake offers that. are they able to find deception beacons or what have you in your network, right? So, if you're not constantly, testing and evaluating, where your vendors are looking, and getting ready for the big game, then you're going to miss out. And for me, my personal motto is every day is game day in cybersecurity, right? You have to bring your game face and be ready. And the way you do that is by practicing.
Yep. Every day is a game day, and every day is a 0 day.
Yeah, no, I think you guys hit it pretty big on the head with the playbook and the game stuff was something I was going to also mention. I mean, we do tests all the time to our analysts. Like we'll hide things in environments. We'll send false stuff across in communications and see if they can pick it up. We'll say, hey, report this finding, and maybe there's nothing in the finding. We'll do release notes and say, contact me if you find this in the release notes. Because what it does is it just makes them all sharper, makes sure that you find where your processes are falling down, things like that. Who's a habitual offender, and what do you do about that? And I think if you can think about those things as a part of your culture and things like that we talked about, they will step up the game across the board for everybody too.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly if the events of the last year have taught us something, it's that anything that we think is never going to happen in our lifetime is actually going to happen in our lifetime, right? I mean, you look at all of us on Zoom, for pretty much the better part of a year now. So, all right, so we're almost out of time. Maybe one parting thought from each of you. A tip to the audience, or anything think about. Again, maybe I'll start with my top left here, George.
For me, I think the thing that's keeping me up at night relative to SolarWinds is just, seeing that it looks like they were using SolarWinds as a stepping stone, to other security companies as perhaps stepping stones into other organizations, right? So, you saw them get into Palo and FireEye, but there's a whole list of others, Malwarebytes. So, I don't think that this is going to go away. I think now is the time to take a hard look at ourselves and make sure that we think that we're confident we have things covered.
Malcolm?
Yeah, I go back to the simple statement I made. Trust is the attack surface. So look at the things that you're trusting the most and how they will they could kill you. Because that's the thing that we're probably not looking at the hardest.
And Jason?
Yeah, I would just say if your adversary is persistent, try to be persistent yourself, and look at those who are ambitious in your teams. Leverage those skill sets, let them dig in, let them research, let them get better, and just keep a continuous pressure on improving your programs, and it'll help the defense.
Yeah, Jason, I think I see a new marketing slogan: advanced persistent defense. All right, with that, we're completely out of time, folks. Malcolm, George, Jason, thanks as always for a great discussion. Thanks to the audience for chiming in and getting us to weigh in on topics. This is always fun to do. So we look forward to doing it again. And if you've got ideas and topics you'd like us to cover, we'd be happy to do that. And you can always visit us and see our upcoming schedule on awakesecurity.com/webinars. Thanks and take care. Stay safe.